So welcome, all of you. It's absolutely wonderful to see the chapel full. I don't know if we've seen this since the last few years, so thank you all for coming. And welcome to our first public lecture of the Judeo-Christian Studies series for this year. Tonight we are indebted to the Mariana and Rabbi Julian Feibelman Memorial Lecture, and co-sponsored also, I see some of our members from Shir Chadash, Beth Israel, and Toro Synagogue. So, thank you all. Oh, and Tulane Jewish Studies Department. And I see a lot of students, so thank you all for being here. I want to turn the podium over now to Toby David, who is going to introduce our speaker. Toby is a teacher at the Jewish Community Day School and has been a teaching assistant for Jewish Studies at Tulane.
Thank you, Rana. It's an honor to be introducing Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum, Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies and the Rabbi Sachs Chair in Modern Jewish Thought, established by the Zandan family. I feel personally very excited about tonight's talk because I have been lucky enough to see Rabbi Dr. Zarum speak before. Once here in New Orleans at the invaluable Jewish Learning Conference Limud Fest, returning this spring. So save the date for that. I don't remember it offhand, but we'll be telling you about it. And then at the Limud Festival in England in 2018, where he gave a talk that added an entirely new perspective to the way that I understand the figure of Isaac in the Bible. So I'm personally anticipating tonight's talk as a sort of prequel to that one. Raphael Zarum has followed a most unusual and fascinating path. He received a Ph.D. in theoretical physics from King's College, London, and published papers on quantum chaos theory. I'd love to know about the connections that he sees between that field and his rabbinic studies, in particular his deep interest in traditional Jewish texts, developed in part through studies at the Judith Lady Montefiore College in London, as well as Yeshivat HaKotel in Jerusalem. In case the convergence of theoretical physics and rabbinic studies isn't enough for you, Rabbi Dr. Zarum also received a master's degree in adult education from the Institute of Education in London, and he is actively involved in writing and teaching in that sphere as well. Rabbi Dr. Zarum holds the inaugural chair named for Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who, as many of you know, was the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. He was a beloved teacher and mentor of Raphael Zarum and participated in his rabbinic ordination. The numerous prestigious positions Rabbi Zarum has held include the Jerusalem Fellows Program at the Mandel Leadership Institute in Israel, the first head of faculty of the Florence Melton Adult Mini School UK, and director of a text-based Jewish education program. Rabbi Dr. Zarum writes regularly for the public press as well as scholarly journals. I imagine many readers would greatly appreciate his recent booklet, which I happen to have here, Big Questions, Brief Answers, presenting thought-provoking short responses to 33 challenging questions about Judaism. A pamphlet entitled Recovery, published last year, collected 7 readings for the Passover Seder concerned with the road to recovery beyond the pandemic. Another recent publication is a practical guide for meaningful prayer on the high holidays, which begin in just a few days. The biblical passage traditionally read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, is the episode of Abraham's binding of Isaac, the Akeidah, and that is the subject of tonight's talk. Why did God tell Abraham to sacrifice his son? Which I know we're all very eager to hear, so please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and to Rona for inviting me to be here with such a wide range of people. It's a real honor to be in this place and to learn with you just for a few minutes some different ideas you might not have seen. The near sacrifice of Isaac must stand as one of the most shocking parts of the Torah. How could it be that a benevolent, good God would demand not only a murder, but a father to murder his only son. And we teach this to children. You have to think about that. So, but before I go into specifics, I just want to talk a little bit about how I'm going to read this. And this is something that I've thought about a lot in terms of religious texts, because religious texts are read by academics, and they're led by religious faith communities. And we look at them in different kinds of ways. So the religious community will read a text uncritically. It is an authoritative text from their faith that they want to believe in, and they want to accept what they're being told from it, and allow the text to teach them and judge them of what kind of person they should be. Whereas the academic approach is, in some ways, the reverse. It's intentionally critical. It looks at the context. It tries to understand where this text came from, but it doesn't believe in its authority. In fact, the authority is in the academic investigator. They're the expert in the field, and they are going to tell us what the text means. And instead of the text judging them, they judge the text. So it's kind of a clash. But truth is, that's a bit of a caricature that I've done of two fields, because in truth, both a religious approach and an academic approach are much more nuanced when they become more mature. So Judaism never, even though a religious person will read the text of the Torah and take them as their faith, they won't read them uncritically. Every page of the Talmud has questions on verses of the Torah and in the Bible. So fundamentally, it can't be that. And similarly, academia has matured in many ways to do literary readings of these texts, and isn't just trying to work out historically where they came from or tell us what they mean, but understand them from the genre from which they come. So I think they might be coming from different places, but academic and religious approaches often do converge in taking something from being superficial to being serious. And that's how I want to read this text of the Akeidah. The Akeidah is the Hebrew word for the binding of Isaac, when Abraham bound him before he nearly killed him. So, let me introduce and begin, and we'll get inside the text. So first of all, just look at source 1 on your handout. We're not going to go through the entire text, but just the key verses at the end. It's chapter 22 of Genesis. Abraham has known God for quite some time now, since chapter 12. He's followed God's command all the way to Israel. He's had a promise of a future, the covenant of the pieces. He's fought a battle in terms of saving his nephew Lot. And there's a whole relationship that God's already had with Abraham. And then in chapter 22, God appears to Abraham and says to him, I want you to take your son, your only son, the one you love, just in case you weren't sure, Isaac, and take him up to sacrifice him on a mountain. And Abraham doesn't argue, he just goes and does it. And when he's about to kill him, here we have in the verse, chapter 22, verse 10, Vayishlach Avraham et yado, and Abraham stretched forth his hands, Vayikach et ma'achelet lishchot et beno, and he picked up the knife to shecht, to slaughter his son. It's really dramatically done. You see him going and picking up the knife, gradually doing it. Vayikra elav malach Hashem min hashemayim, and an angel of God calls from the heavens. Vayomer and says, Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham. Vayomer, and he says, Hineni, here I am. Vayomer, and the voice says, Al tishlach yadcha el hana'ah, don't stretch forth your hand to the boy. Va'al taseh lo mu'umah, don't even make any kind of blemish on him. Don't do anything to him. Ki ata yadati, because now I know, ki yoreh Hashem ata, that you fear or you revere God. And you didn't withhold your son from me. So it reads like a test. I wanted to see if you'd do it. You were willing to do it, and you wouldn't withhold anything from me. So now I know that you're God-fearing. Is that the measure that we want? Is that the way we're supposed to look at it? It's kind of outrageous. And there's a quote I want to read out to you from not the greatest religious person, Richard Dawkins. As a scientist, a brilliant biologist, I love his works, The Selfish Gene, these important works to read. But he also got involved in the approaches of the New Atheists, and he wrote quite a polemical book called The God Delusion in 2007. And this is what Richard Dawkins, the atheist, says about our text tonight. He says, by the standards of modern morality, This disgraceful story is an example simultaneously of child abuse, bullying in two asymmetric power relationships, and the first recorded use of the Nuremberg defense. I was only obeying orders. Yet the legend is one of the great foundational myths of the three monistic religions. Now, you can see the way he's writing. Right? He's taking this classical biblical text and putting on modern sensibilities and saying it's completely shocking. Now, there's an element of truth to what he's saying, but we feel uncomfortable when he talks in that way. So let me show you that the rabbis and Jewish tradition knew full well how shocking this text was. They didn't hide it, they knew full well. Look at source 4, which says this very well. Now we're going to read a text of Midrash. Some of you will be familiar with what Midrash is, but Midrash is the scholarly, analytical work of the rabbis trying to understand the deeper meanings of these texts. Genesis Rabbah, which is the Midrash on Bereshit, is probably contemporary with the Mishnah, 1st, 2nd century even. It's really an important classic rabbinic text. And they're not trying to tell you what really happened. They tell you little stories to unpack more deeply what's behind the text. I think the rabbis of the 1st to 5th century were incredible readers, nuanced readers of the Hebrew, and really looked to understand what it was saying. So look at this Midrash on source 4. What does it say? When our father Abraham stretched forth his hand to take the knife to slay his son, the angels wept. Bachu malchei hasharet. So if this is a purely moral good thing, and we should all be happy that Abraham's willing to kill his son, why would it be the angels are crying? Angels are crying implies something bad and sad. Hadu dichtiv, this is as it says, and they quote from Isaiah, behold, their valiant ones, that means the angels, cry. And what do they cry? Chutzah. Now what does the word chutzah mean? So the Gemara says, what does chutzah mean? Rabbi Zarum said chutzah means chitzah, right, or chutz, which means outside, or unnatural, or strange. So the angels are shouting out, unnatural, weird, what are you doing? And the Gemara then says, Berei michas yaberei, a creature that kills its own child, that's unnatural. Now that rabbinic text, if I had taken off the rabbinic origins and just said a quote from someone who says that the Akeidah, the sacrifices are natural, you'd say that's not a religious point of view. But this is an authentic rabbinic text. My point being, they clearly knew that it was surprising, that it was a shocking text. Maybe it's intentionally shocking. The fact that people today and academics are still discussing this text may be on purpose, in which case it's more deeper than we thought, and we have to understand what it's all about. Now, an approach I'm going to take here is to not just look at rabbinic texts of how the rabbis learn this story, but on liturgical text, how we pray it. What do I mean? In the standard Siddur, the daily prayer book, the Akeidah, this story should be read every morning as one of the preliminary parts after the initial prayers to read this story. Not everybody does it, right? There's that and the sacrifices, and people like to sacrifice those and miss them out and just go a bit later. But it's in the text. And as you mentioned, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read it as well. So I'm interested not just how the rabbis understand it, but how was it put into prayer? Because there's some fascinating contextual paragraphs that transform its meaning. So, and you can see from source 2 and 3 that in Jewish law, you're supposed to do it. The Shulchan Aruch in source 2 is the 16th century book by Yosef Karo, known as the Mechaber, which is a kind of a general compendium of Jewish law. And it says it is good to write the passage of the Akeidah every single day. He mentions other ones as well. It's actually meant to be read. And in the next source, in source 3, the Mishnah Brura, which is another compilation of Jewish law. These are standard texts that every rabbi will recognize, by the Chavetz Chaim, Rav Yisrael Meir Kagan. What does he say? The passage of the Akeidah, the passage of the near sacrifice of Isaac, this should be recited before the passages dealing with sacrifices, even on Shabbat, you should say it. So every day of the year, this text was read at the beginning of prayers. So it's clearly important for the rabbis. It is not sufficient to just say these words, but one must contemplate what they say and recognize the ones of God. Now, this is interesting. You can't just read those words. You have to understand what you're being told. And prayer is the philosophy of the rabbis in practice. Now, rabbis didn't write philosophy books. They got us to pray it. And what they made Jews pray every day was what they believed, their values, spoken out loud together in community before God. The reason for saying these passages, says the Mishnah Berurah, is as follows. The passages of the Akeidah is said in order that we should remember the merit of the forefathers every day, and also in order that one should learn to subdue their inclination, just as Isaac handed over his life. L'achniya yitzro, to subdue your inclination. So Abraham's inclination would have been to hug his son, not to slaughter him. And he's meant to subdue fatherly love and care for his child. And Isaac's supposed to subdue his innate need to stop it, don't kill me, Dad, and let it go. And that's something I should concentrate and think about as a religious Jew every single morning, to subdue those feelings. I've got 2 daughters. I love them. I don't want to subdue my feelings to my daughters. On the contrary, I thought Judaism teaches me to love and care for my children. So what's going on? How can it say this? What does it mean to subdue these feelings? So, let me try and explain what I think is going on here. And, yes. And to do this, I'm going to look at a number of different approaches, but let's just give me one more source to show you how much we're excited about Abraham getting on with this text. When we read the text in source 1, did you notice that God shouted out, Abraham, Abraham? He shouted out twice. And then he said, don't kill him, don't even touch him. Now imagine you were Abraham and you're about to do it. If you don't want to do it, just like any work you don't want to do, the slightest attempt to move you away from it, if someone distracts you with some small thing, you immediately go, right, I'm not doing the work, I've got something else to do. All right? They go, Raphael, oh yeah, I wasn't going to do it, I was busy anyway. But he goes, Avraham, talks twice. Shouldn't once be enough? And he says, don't kill him, don't even touch him. So say, Mom, don't even make one little thing. So why the repetition? And the Midrashic explanation, which is brought by Rashi in source 5, is fascinating. Lay not your hand to slay him. All right, that's the first bit. Don't put your hand to kill him. Then Abraham said to God, if this is it, then I've come here for nothing. All right, you told me to slaughter. If you tell me stop now, I don't get to do it. So he goes, let me at least wound him and draw some blood. Can I just cut off a little finger, please? Just a little cut, something. Right? And God says, no, don't do anything. Not even a blemish. It's wild. The implication is not that he didn't want to, but he was dying to. So he's about to kill him. He goes, Abraham. He's like, no, I want to kill him. Abraham, okay, what? You can't kill him. But I really want, you can't even cut a finger. Okay, fine. So it's wild. The implication from this text is he wants to do it. And that shows some kind of love of God to murder. This is a very dangerous text in some ways. So, what's going on? So, I'm going to suggest 4 different rabbinic approaches to how they understand this text. Well, you might like them, you might not, but I have to read the text as they come and understand them. And for my research, and I wanted to understand for myself, as a parent as well, what this text meant, I looked through the rabbinic sources to try to understand. They clearly from that source I showed you earlier, they knew full well it was shocking. What do they think the purpose was? I'm going to give you 4 approaches. And I'm calling them gross misunderstanding. That's number 1. Number 2 is a theological lesson. Number 3 is a moral subversion. And number 4 is an existential revelation. And I'll try and explain what those 4 approaches are. So, let's go straight in with our first approach, which is gross misunderstanding. And this is a really fascinating one, because I don't know if you know this, but the story of the Akeidah, of this story, is in the Quran as well. But instead of it taking place with Abraham and Isaac, it's Abraham and Ishmael. And the other difference is that the way they understand, the way the Muslims understand this text is that it wasn't really Ishmael, it was really Isaac. It was really Ishmael, not Isaac. And that the Jewish version is a corruption of the text. Because Isaac is tricked. He doesn't know what's going to be happening. And he says to his father, behold, I haven't given you the text here, but he says, Dad, you've got the wood, where's the offering? Hint, hint. And his dad says, God's going to provide. So Isaac is tricked, whereas in the version in the Quran, this is in Surah 37, section 102, Ishmael is a willing participant, and he says, "O Father, do as you are commanded. Allah willing, you shall find me among the steadfast." And Isaac really wants to be sacrificed as well. So there's also Christian explanations of this, and all three monotheistic religions seem at face value to take this very literally as an ideal that Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son. So the reason I mention that is because the rabbis did recognize there were lots of misunderstandings in the conversation between Abraham and God. And you could read it as not just as them putting a voice into Abraham, but they themselves, the rabbis, were confused by this text. And so they put that confusion into a made-up conversation in source 6 over here. And again from Midrash Rabbah. And it goes as follows. Said Rav Acha, Abraham wondered, "It's very surprising to hear these words, God, when you say, sacrifice my son. After all, yesterday you said, for in Isaac shall seed be called to you." So remember, the Akeidah is chapter 22 that we're doing. This is chapter 21. So the rabbis go, look back at the previous chapter. God says to Abraham, Isaac, your son, is going to be the future. So instead of the rabbis going, how could God say that? They say, Abraham says, God, I don't understand. Yesterday you told me he's the future. Now you're telling me to sacrifice him. And they say, and then Abraham says, you said Isaac is seed, and then you tell me now, take up your son to sacrifice him, and now you tell me, don't put a hand on him, don't sacrifice him. In brackets, make up your mind. And the word in Hebrew is et maha. This is really surprising. Now, is that Abraham saying it's surprising? It's really the rabbis going, we don't know what's going on. How could God have said this when the previous chapter he said something else? It reminds me of there was an English comedy program called Spitting Image, which they did a kind of jokes about political leaders as kind of Muppet-type dummies in the 90s. And they once did one about God, where they interview God, and God's in heaven with white flowing hair, cutting the roses. And the reporter goes, it says in the Hebrew Bible that the Jewish people were the chosen of God. Yes, God, that's right. He goes, but you also said in the New Testament that Jesus, it goes, yes, I did say that. And they start challenging him with all these things until he's all confused and just goes away and says, I'm not talking to you. So there's a confusion going on here. What's God doing? Said the Holy One to him, the continuation of the text, Abraham, my covenant will I not profane, nor will I change what I've uttered. So the rabbis quote a verse from Psalms and say, the covenant I made with you, Abraham, about the future of Isaac is never questioned. I never questioned it. And when I told you, take now your son, I didn't tell you to slay him, but rather just bring him up. Really? Yeah, if you look back at the chapter, it says, Havela lo olah, bring him up. Olah is to bring up. Now the word olah later on becomes the burnt offering. But it's not used like that here. It could just say, I just meant bring him up. And it's even better, he says, I told you this to be affectionate. Affectionate? You've taken him up, fulfilled my words, now take him down. Bring up your son to show him to me on this mountain, and now take him down again. Really? That's the rabbis. Is that a reasonable reading into the text? And this is what is written. And their proof, the rabbis go, look at the verse in Jeremiah. They have built shrines to Baal, that's the idol of the idolatrous central worship of the ancient Canaanite nation, to put their children to the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I never commanded, never decreed, and which never came to my mind. It's a killer verse the rabbis are bringing. Right, what are they saying? In Hebrew, it's even better, right? Lo tziviti, lo dibati, lo altali. I didn't even think of ever doing this. How could ever a parent try and kill their child? And this is similar to source 7, Deuteronomy, which is the idolatrous approach of Molech. Molech is where you take your child and you pass them between two panels of fire, probably to their death, as a way of showing worship and respect to your God. If any of you, it's quite surprising, but if any of you saw the Marvel movie Endgame, or actually the previous one, Infinity War, that's exactly what the baddie does to get his final jewel. He has to be willing to sacrifice his daughter. The story of Thanos and his daughter Gamora is Abraham and Isaac, if you look carefully, that he's willing to sacrifice for a higher ideal, which is a mistake, but is in there. So I always get fascinated when I sit in movies and I realize that they're just quoting the Bible, unbeknownst to them often. Anyway, so the rabbis are very clear. It cannot be that Abraham was ever going to sacrifice his son, or rather he wanted to, but that God ever wanted him to do it. I just wanted to see what you would do. I just wanted to find out what you are willing to do, but I never would have let you kill him. I wanted to see how much you would do things for me to show your reverence for me. Now, if that's the correct reading, then Abraham almost failed. Because Abraham would have killed him if God hadn't stopped him. And God never would have wanted him to kill his son. So in this version of it, Abraham almost fails the test. He needs to do it. And this, on a kind of psychological level, is a fundamental issue in religious belief. We sometimes feel, actually it's not just religious, in relationships, that to prove that you care, you need to make a dramatic moment statement. I'm willing to do this. I'll stay up all night. I'll get rid of all this dramatic moment. But any mature person knows in terms of relationships that to show that you value a relationship isn't just a momentary expression of love, it's an ongoing commitment. So when I read that it says, you brought him up, now take him down, I read it as, take him down as live. Don't prove that you love God through one moment of a reverent act, but through your ongoing life do it. In other words, find out what you're willing to die for, but then live for it, which is much harder. Because the dramatic, all guns blazing, fall into the fire, the moment of dramatic passion looks brilliant and amazing, but true relationship is ongoing. And maybe that's what God was also showing Abraham. Don't come up and do these one-off moments and sacrifice your sons like Molech or later on is going to happen. Don't be like that. Live in relationship for me. Maybe that's the aim. The problem with that approach is it doesn't really help on Isaac's trauma after the fact. Right? What did Isaac think that his father nearly killed him? How could we take that approach? So this first approach of a gross misunderstanding is definitely a clever reading by the rabbis. It recognizes the chapter before that it couldn't have been. It's trying to kill him in the verse in Jeremiah. That all works really well. But still, and Abraham may be losing, maybe makes us lose a bit of respect for Abraham, that he nearly failed. Or maybe he's human like us. But what about Isaac? What about the trauma he goes through? So a second approach I want to give you is what's called a theological lesson. There's a lesson to this text. And the story isn't that important. What do you mean it's not important? It's the words of the Torah. It's the Bible, right? It's read in synagogue every week. In fact, 3 times a week. So Maimonides, source 8, in his Guide for Perplexed, the great philosopher, writes this wonderful explanation of the reasons for the laws and the difficult passages in the Torah, gives his interpretation of what it's really about. And he says something which, when you read it carefully, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is really quite shocking. Look what he says. You should know, he always begins like that, know that the sole object of all the trials mentioned in the Torah is to teach humanity what they ought to do or believe. So the event which forms the actual trial is not the end desired, but it is an example of our instruction and guidance. Really? So that means the story is not the end. It's not, the Torah isn't, let me tell you what happened to Abraham. So the Torah is just an account of historically what happened. That's not the case. The Torah is very selective in what it says. I want to Nahum Leibovitz say this. It's not like a film, right? It's very, if it was a film, it would be much more dramatic. God would say, Abraham, Abraham, and God would take out a cigar and blow it calmly and say, God, Hineni, here I am. And dramatic, but it just says Hineni. It just has staccato certain phrases that it wants us to know. And these are to teach us moral lessons, not to just tell us what happened. For Maimonides, it's not even important what happened. It might not even possibly have literally happened. Because if you look at the Hebrew, he says, Shahayam Mashal. That it's and a mashal is like it's like an allegory. An allegory, did the story actually happen? It's not clear, Maimonides. Some read from other things that he says that maybe this was a vision that the whole thing was a vision that Abraham had. That in his dream, God appears to him. In his dream, God says, and he nearly does, and then God shouts out. Possibly. Right? That might make you feel better that it never happened. It might not, but that's not important to Maimonides. The only value of this book is the moral lessons it teaches us. Don't think what happened, think how then shall I live? And then he explains, hence the words, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet nor that dreamer. I'll explain to you actually outside what this means. If we went back to the text, source 1, remember what it said? It said, if you look at the end of it, verse 12, God says, now I know that you fear God. Right? That was in source 1. God says, or the angel, but it's representing God. Now I know that you fear God. What What do you mean God says, now I know? You mean you didn't know before? You're God. You're supposed to know these things. You're supposed to know everything. Why would God ever test the person? They know what they're going to get because they know them. They can read what they are, not just what they do. And Maimonides was clear about this. It couldn't be that God was somehow lacking some knowledge. So when God says, now I know, Yadati, it can't be that there was knowledge that God didn't have. So he reinterprets what the phrase, now I know, means. It doesn't mean now I know. It means now it is known. So now I know is now I have made known by you reading this story. You see that? That's what he's effectively writing over here. So the term to know means so that all people may know. Now I have made known by this story what Abraham was willing to do, and as a role model for all Jewish people, what you should be willing to do but would never do. How far would you go for God? It's an educational lesson. But did it really happen? Does it literally, for Maimonides, literally doesn't matter. He's trying to work out the gavul of Yirat Hashem, the boundary of reverence for God. Now, this is why that the text of the Akeidah, the sacrifice of Isaac, became one that Jews really valued through history. And through persecutions, when Jews often were murdered and died believing in their faith, they remembered this story of Abraham and Isaac. Basically, they saw themselves as like Isaac. Not sacrificed by God, but sacrificed by enemies because they believed in God. And so this text meant a lot to them because it's like, yes, I'll die for I don't want to, but I'm willing to die for my faith, or I'm dying as a result of my faith. It's this very sad thing that happened, but that's what this story took on, that meaning. And Maimonides talks about these aspects of it. So in that sense, that's why I'm calling this a theological lesson. Don't be hung up on the morality of it, because it's not important, and it might not have happened, but it shows you what a person will be willing to do. So it's a story to dramatize a theological point about the nature of God, that God always knows, but God wants to make known this idea. So that's the second approach. I'm conscious of time, so I'm doing these quite briefly. The third approach, which for me is most fascinating, is a moral subversion. Remember what we said in an earlier source, that you're supposed to subdue your inclination. So just like Abraham was willing to subdue his feeling of kindness to his son and be willing to sacrifice him, so he was willing to subdue his compassion and be willing to sacrifice his son, so we should learn to subdue our inclinations. So are we meant to learn to subdue our compassion? No. It's more subtle than that, and I'll explain to you how it works. This is the third approach of moral subversion. Look at source 9. There's another midrash, again from the same period. And Abraham called the name of the place that God will see. Yes, look at the third line. Abraham said to God, Sovereign of the universe, when you ordered me, take now your son, your only son, I could have answered, yesterday you promised me that from Isaac will be the seed. The same verse we quoted earlier. I love this one, right? This version. Abraham says to God, God, I could have said, yesterday you told me to do something else. What's going on? I could have argued with you. And now you say, take your son. But I didn't do that. I did not do this. But instead I suppressed my feelings of compassion in order to do your will. Now, at that point you understand. That's what we've had the whole way through. You suppress your compassion. But look at the next bit. It's wild. So may it be your will, O Lord our God, that when Isaac's children, that's the Jewish people, are in trouble, you will remember that the Akeidah, the binding, in their favor, and be filled with compassion for them. You see the switch? It's quite subtle. Because Abraham was willing to subdue his compassion, you should have compassion. Doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. It gets worse. Turn over. Look at source 10. This is the paragraph that comes after the reading of the binding of Isaac, the Akeidah, every day. Again, it's in small print, and as many rabbis teach you, there's a reason why it's in small print. Do you read the small print in a contract? No. So why would you read it in a prayer book? I'm joking. Just trying to keep you awake. The truth is, this is the paragraph that comes straight after. So this is the rabbinic lesson of how we're supposed to understand the text that we just read. Look what it says. Master of the universe, may it be your will, Lord our God and God of our fathers, that you recall for our sake the covenant of our fathers. Remember this covenant between God and Abraham. And just as our father Abraham suppressed his compassion for his only son, you get that, and wanted to slaughter him to do your will, so may your compassion suppress your anger against us. Do you see the switcheroo? Do you see the switcheroo? May your compassion suppress your anger. No. It should be the reverse. It should be that your compassion is suppressed. But they flick it around. Now, what's going on here? And it was years till I realized this lesson. So just like Abraham suppressed his compassion, please let your compassion suppress your anger. It's an exact contradiction. Doesn't make sense. And it says, and may your compassion prevail over all other attributes. So the only way I can read and understand this is the following. First of all, it could be a switch of the rabbis. The rabbis did not want the idea of suppressing compassion to be a Jewish value. So they switched it. And they made it that compassion suppresses anger. That's possible. But I read it slightly more subtly. When we read at the beginning that the rabbis say you're supposed to suppress your inclinations, Akeidah doesn't mean suppress, it means control more. So maybe the text is, Abraham controlled his compassion in order to sacrifice his son. And God, we want you similarly to control your compassion, but not to subdue it, but to control it, to use it to suppress your anger. That's possible reading of the text. In which case, it's a moral subversion of the story, or that's maybe the intention of the story always. We're supposed to learn, unbelievably, compassion over anger. Anytime you're angry and want to hit or get angry or violent with somebody, you're supposed to learn compassion. Where from? From the near sacrifice of Isaac. It seems completely shocking, but it's right there in the prayer book, right? And if you read it carefully, it kind of makes sense. Be more aware of your compassion. Abraham was very aware. He had this feeling, of course I don't want to do this, how can I? And he welled up compassion inside him. He was aware of it. So the rabbis are reading, the welling up of compassion is what we want in life. We should be imitating God and always feel compassion. God should always feel compassion in any situation when someone is low and difficult. Instead of being angry or blame, why is that? The compassionate approach. Rachamim is fundamental to what God is. And they learned it from the last text on the planet in the Torah you'd expect to get it from. But that's what they got. So that's the third approach of compassion. But I want to give, and by the way, at the moment, I don't know if you know this, but religious Jews from all different denominations say slichot, extra prayers before Rosh Hashanah. The Ashkenazim do it for a week before, Sephardim a bit more serious, and they do it a month before. And they say these extra prayers. So instead of morning prayers being at 6:45, they're at 6:30. And they do these prayers at the beginning. And they're all about asking God for mercy and understanding. And the phrase that's repeated over and over again, I said it this morning in the Chabad, just around the corner from here. The phrase that I said 3 times in a row is Kurachem av al banim, kein turachem Hashem aleinu. Just as a father or a parent is merciful to their children, so you should be merciful upon us. It's a fundamental line. If you go to Shul and Rosh Hashanah, you will hear it many times. In all the times that we do a supplication on Yom Kippur, a vidui, this will come up. Kurachem av banim, just as a parent is merciful and forgiving to their child, so God be merciful upon us. And they get that, again, from the Akeidah, from Abraham. So it really is, in some ways, a subversion, or maybe the real intention of the text, and a completely radical rabbinic reading. So, I've given you 3. I've given you a gross misunderstanding, a theological lesson, and a moral subversion, but I want to give you briefly, just very briefly, one more. Because this text is so unusual, is so out of the blue, that I can't not share it with you. And when I read it in the Talmud, it really helped me understand who Isaac was as a person, and for, I think, the deepest reading of the Akeidah, which is an existential revelation of the nature of what it means to be human. So here's the story, okay? Here's the story, and it's an imagination, a rabbinic story in the future, and it goes like this. Rav Shmuel bar Nachi said, what does it mean for you are our father? It's a quote from Isaiah. You are our father. Abraham doesn't know us. Israel, meaning Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Abraham didn't know us. Jacob didn't recognize us, but you, God, are our father and our Redeemer. Who's missing? Isaac. So the rabbis go, what does this verse mean? Abraham didn't understand, didn't know us. Israel didn't recognize us, but you, God, are our Redeemer. And it says it twice. And the rabbis interpret this. What does it mean? So look after it. It says, in the future to come, God will say to Abraham, your children against me have sinned against me. So this is a rabbinic text. It might not have literally happened. It's an imagination of a conversation of Abraham and God in heaven. And basically, God goes to Abraham sometime in the future, which could be any time, based on how much us Jewish people sin. And God says to Abraham, your children have sinned. You know those great people that I started the covenant with you? Look down there, they're sinning. What do you say? Look what the text says. Abraham will answer God, Ribono shel olam, sovereign of the universe, let them be wiped out for the sanctification of your name. What did we do? It must have been pretty bad if Abraham, the kind Abraham, wants to say, we've gone too far, wipe us out. So God says, I will say to Jacob, who experienced the pain of bringing up children. So God's not happy with Abraham's response. God wants to forgive him. God's always like that. God's looking for someone to convince him. Abraham goes, they've gone too far this time, the Jewish people. They're really bad. Wipe them out. So he's not impressed. He goes, I'll go to Jacob, because Jacob had Surus with his children. Right? Jacob had difficult children. Shimon and Levi were killing, and Joseph went away, and Judah had lots of problems. Jacob understands parenting. I'll go to Jacob. So he goes to Jacob. Then I'll say to Jacob, who experienced pain. So he will say to Jacob, your children have sinned. Jacob will answer God, sovereign of the universe, let them be wiped out for the sanctification of your name. And God will retort, there's no reason in old men and no counsel in children. So obviously they both became old, but relatively, Abraham's the grandfather and Isaac and Jacob is the grandson. So the old guys don't understand and the kids don't understand. No one gets it. I'm going to go to Isaac. Isaac might get it. So he goes to Isaac's house in heaven. You know, this is metaphorical, so you can have a house as well. Why not? They sit for breakfast. God having breakfast, it's a metaphor. You can eat breakfast in a metaphor. So they're sitting over breakfast, and God says to Isaac, your children have sinned against me. Right? And Isaac will say, sovereign of the universe, are they my children? They're not your children? Notice the difference. Right? Abraham and Jacob immediately said, wipe them out. Not only does Isaac not say that, he's being a bit facetious. My children? Banai, banecha, they're your children. Right? Because when you gave precedence, we will do and we'll listen. It's a quote from the Bible. You said, Israel, my son, my firstborn. Right? So Isaac quotes the Bible at God. I love they do this. So Isaac gets out the Torah, says, chapter 4 of Exodus, you call them my children. Right? So they're your children, not mine, God. So why are you blaming me? Right? And now all of a sudden, they're my sons and not your sons. And then Isaac, I cannot, but this is a true text. Okay, this is from Gemara, Talmud, Shabbat. Edited 7th, 8th century, but probably going back at least 5th century, so it's 1,500 years old. This is a very traditional text, and it's wild. What does Isaac say? Isaac says to God, anyway, how long does a person really live anyway, God? And God says, well, about 70 years. So Abraham goes, so Isaac goes, yes, he says, but wait a second, the first 20 years you forgive people. Right? So when a person gets married, the rabbinic idea was in their 20s, they get forgiven for their early life. So you forgive them for the first 20 years, so take that off. So what are you left with, God? Come on. God, that was 70 months. Okay, I've got 50. 50, fine. So you want to wipe out the Jewish people for 50 years of sinning. But wait a second. They got to sleep. That's about half the time. How much sinning can you do when you're asleep? So that's 25. Take 25 off, God. What you got left? God's like 50, 25. So God's going to wipe out the whole of the Jewish people for 25 years of sin. So then Isaac goes, well, there's more. You've got to pray. How much can you sin when you're praying? You've got to eat. You've got to go to the toilet. Right? You can't really sin that much. That's another 12 and a half years, give or take, no? So now we're down to 12 and a half years of sinning. And you want to wipe out all the Jewish people for just 12 and a half years. And then Isaac says, amazing. Now, if you will, by the way, if you don't believe me, I've given you the Aramaic, so you can look it up on Safaria. This is the translation of the text. I am dramatizing it and bringing some humor in, because when you read it, that's what's going on. But people often don't, but it really is clearly this. Anyway, now, if Isaac says to God, now, if you will shoulder all that, 12 and a half years, don't get so upset about 12 and a half years of sinning. It's not that bad. So you shoulder it, God. Forgive him. And if you can't, then put half on me. I'll take the weight of a half of that. And should you say, you know what, can't, then I'll take all 12 and a half. After all, I got offered up before you as a sacrifice. That's got to count for something. That's what he's saying. It's amazing. Isaac answers back God facetiously. He's joking. By the way, the word Isaac, Yitzchak, is from the root sachat, which means to laugh. He is playing with God. How bad is it really? I mean, come on. And at the end of the day, his killer line is, and anyway, I nearly got sacrificed. I nearly died for this, so I could take all that weight. And what's the reaction? Then Isaac shall say to them, Then the people will say, for you, remember that verse we began with, Abraham doesn't know and Jacob doesn't know, but you are our father? That first you isn't God, it's Isaac. You are our father. Then Isaac will say, instead of praising me, praise the Holy One. And Isaac will show them God with their own eyes. Immediately they'll say, you, God, are our father. So this is a whole interpretation of that line, that Abraham, in a future time when the Jewish people sinned incredibly and shockingly, they deserve wiping out. It must have been pretty bad for Abraham and Jacob, these wonderful patriarchs of ours. But when God goes to Isaac, Isaac goes, come on, really? You're going to destroy them for this? What's the Isaac text about? What's the point of the story? So I think what Isaac is saying to God is, you want me to justify my existence to you, who created me? You think I can do that? There was this great postmodern novel where in the 3rd chapter, the author turns up and explains to the protagonist that he's going to kill him in the next chapter. And the protagonist tries to make an argument of why he shouldn't be killed by the author. And the author goes, yeah, but I'm doing the writing here. Right? How could we justify anything if we believe in God as our creator? God made us. God can do what God ever wants. We can never justify our existence. And Isaac says, since I can't justify it, and you've granted it to me, I'm going to take it for granted. I'll say that again. Because you granted me life, I'm going to take life for granted. I don't have to justify myself to you. You've got to justify yourself to me because you made me. It's an existential revelation of the nature of humanity. And this is something that is fundamental to Jewish thought. We answer back God, even against God, because God made us in his image, and therefore we have the ability to argue at every level and challenge any issue. And that is the fourth approach. And therefore the Akeidah here, this story of the near sacrifice of Isaac, is meant to be an open wound, something unsolvable, a challenge on morality that forces Jews who studied this, and anybody, for thousands of years to try and make sense of it and try and get the morality in. It forces you to say, it can't be this, it must be that we're moral. So we end up talking about morality. And that's what the rabbis did with the prayers. That's what's really going on. It forces us to think about morality and say, it can't be that, and bring compassion into the world. By pushing us to the edge, we bring it back and try and make meaning. So I'm very conscious of time, so I'll stop at this point and we can do questions. But let's just summarize that I gave these 4 different approaches. The gross misunderstanding that we live for Judaism and not die. It's a life over death religion. The theological lesson that Abraham is a role model of how to be. The moral subversion of turning from subduing compassion to handling compassion. And this 4th approach of existential revelation of this the power of Isaac to argue with God and therefore to always argue for justice, as is fundamental to Jewish tradition, in any single context. And by the way, you'll notice in the same Sedra, the same portion of the reading of the week that we read about the sacrifice, how did the Sedra begin? With the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God wants to destroy it, and Abraham goes, no, you can't do that. So in the very same story where he argued with God in one and doesn't in the other, shows you that this is all part of a relationship with God, about acceptance and arguing all at the same time. Now, have I answered the question? No way. My teacher, Rabbi Sachs, I remember so clearly once, he was giving a lecture on this subject, and someone threw away an argument and made a little joke and everybody laughed. And Rabbi Sachs got really upset, and he said, listen, I have read every commentary there is on the Akeidah, and I haven't begun to understand it. Don't think you understand this. And my reaction to that was, maybe that's even the point, that God would write a text, or traditional text, that is so shocking, we can never let it go. And for thousands of years in the future, Jews, Christians, Muslims, academics, philosophers, and anyone who picks up this text, chapter 22 of Genesis, will wonder what is going on and be forced to look for compassion and understanding and meaning in this harsh and difficult world. Thank you.
Thinking about this text as a prophetic prefiguration of Jesus and his crucifixion and God killing his only son is easier and in some sense more logical than even any of these options. So how, as Jews, could we respond to that?
It's interesting that you say that, because I was going to bring some more of the Christian aspects and look at it, but what's the point of the story in Genesis 22? that God doesn't let Abraham go through with it. That's fundamental, right? So in Christianity, the man kills God. But in Judaism, God is not allowed to tell man to kill man. So it's, in a way, it's a reverse. It mustn't happen. And that's the essence of the story. It mustn't happen. So in that sense, we're not willing to let that happen. You can't die for anybody else in Judaism. Each person dies in their own sin. And I've always, can I say this? Yeah, why not? Judaism is kind of arrogant in that sense. Deuteronomy chapter 14, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem, children you are of the Lord your God. Judaism believes that all humans are the Son of God. Right? All of us. So Jesus was a good Jew in that sense. But in this sense, is you must not go through with it. That's the fundamental difference. I agree it would be easy if you had, but we can't ever. And so Judaism is perpetually hanging with that knife above, with that level of commitment, of giving up, of subduing your own beliefs. By the way, this is very easy for British Jews. If you look at what the Queen, I can't not mention Her Majesty, given that she was recently buried, but she subdued her personal desires in order to be of service for her entire life, till the day she died. That's what submission to service is. And look how much it's become a role model. You're watching it. It's not even your queen, my queen. Why? Because you're impressed with this model of, really, their entire life? And that's, for me, the Abraham of going up and then going down and live. Your entire life, live in service. Don't do it in one moment. Your entire life as a moment of commitment. And that's the real lesson here of a life of service.
This is almost a response to you, because I also, when you were reading, and I was reading the last bit, you get to the part that Isaac is taking the sins of the people. And he says, I've offered myself up before you. That's a very Christian interpretation of this thing. Until the people say, for you, Isaac, are our father.
Right.
Because then the response is, that's where Christianity goes and deifies the son. And here, exactly the opposite. Isaac says to them, instead of praising me, praise the Lord.
Exactly.
That to me, because I read this, it was like, boy, is this a Christian?
Yes. It's often you won't say that because it skates near, but the subtle theology becomes very different. Absolutely.
And then I had a question of much less import, perhaps. The word chutzah in the quote of Isaiah. What does the word mean? What's the context in Isaiah?
It could be like chutzah, get out, or shock. That's what it seems to be in that context. But by the way, in the most important prayer in Jewish prayer, the Amidah, which is said every day, it begins, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And the interpretation of the Baal Shem Tov and many early ones is, why not just say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And the interpretation is, and this actually goes all the way back to the Torah, from certain commentaries, you can look at the Vakanti and the Ramban, says that the God of Abraham wasn't the God of Isaac, and the God of Isaac wasn't the God of Jacob. Each one discovered God for themselves. And we too have to as well. So they are, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are role models for us to find God. But you're not supposed to copy them. Just like they found God, you have to find God. They're not role models you can rely on, right? But you therefore have to do it yourself. So they didn't do it for you. And that's where it becomes different to Christianity. Judaism never says someone else does it for you. They might be a model for you to learn to do it yourself.
Let me start with one of the first things you spoke about, which was that the angels had to say, Abraham, Abraham twice. Because for Abraham, the intent, no suppression, the intent was to kill Isaac. And one of the things that goes throughout all of this commentary, and by the way, through all of Torah, is often God's anger. And it seems to me that this story, along with many of them, have to do with how we and how God deals with anger.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. It's about suppressing that anger. And for me, the lesson of Abraham is that we sometimes get so involved in a passionate moment, awkward, dramatic stance, I'm right, that you lose the capacity to hear the other side or to hear anything. You're lost in the moment. And weirdly, Judaism seems to not want you to do that. It wants you always to feel a sense of compassion. Even when you're loved up in the moment of something, the moral voice inside you must never, ever go. And so the Torah is written in a way for humans to understand. Maimonides says this. So it looks like God gets angry. But I'll give you one example, perfect. Maimonides says, are you allowed to shout at your child to tell them off? And he says, yes. For the sake of discipline, you're allowed to shout at a child on one condition. You're not angry. You're faking it. Because if you're angry, you're not educating your child. You're getting something off your chest. And that's not appropriate. That's not education. But if you're completely calm, and you know that raising a voice will either scare them or emphasize your point, you can raise your voice. You must not do this to tell off the child, but only if you feel no anger. Isn't that amazing what Maimonides is demanding of us to understand that? So anger gets in the way. Think about not why you get angry, but how you get anger. Anger stops you from thinking rationally and reflectively. And in Judaism, it's a very problematic issue. And anger must be suppressed to always understand what you're feeling. You can have righteous anger, I need to do something, but never lose your moral compass and your moral sense of self.
I want to first make something clear in my head, because I'm not as familiar with the scriptures as some people might be. But there was no direct edict by God to say, go kill Isaac.
Right. Well, he says, take your son and raise him up, lo'olah, which you could read as a burnt offering, because later on that's what the word means, or it just means bring him up, and it's not specific.
So I can't help not have this sneaky suspicion that maybe in some way Abraham was testing God and trying to see how far he would go before he said stop?
It's very Jungian to play it backwards, possibly. But you know what's interesting is sometimes God's instructions, actually quite often, are not that clear. And the reason I think that is the case is to reveal the inner psychology of what we want to hear. And is Abraham hearing what was right or not? And God lets you go along for a bit until God reminds you of, were you doing that because that's what I said, or that's what you wanted to hear? So that side of it. In terms of pushing how much you can push God, it's a very Jewish response. What you're saying is, Abraham's testing God. Come on, will you let me kill him? I know you won't, and I know you won't. Right? And God says, no, I can't do it anymore. Right? In the game of chicken, God loses. As a compassionate faith, I'm comfortable with that approach, in terms of its compassion.
Could Abraham's faith in God simply be understood as faith in God's reasonableness or justice, and therefore faith that God will never go ahead with it? So we can take literally his reassurance of Isaac that God will provide something for the sacrifice, so that to the very last minute when he's wielding the knife, right, Abraham has faith that God is going to tell him to stop.
Well, there are some who interpret it that way, but the problem with the approach is that why have to shout out twice? And why say don't even touch him? It implies that Abraham was loved up in the moment and couldn't stop and wanted to do it. But it might have been that morally, it's still the wrong thing to do, but he was taken in the moment and couldn't do it. But your interpretation is definitely what the rabbis read. The rabbis were confident it would never happen.
A couple of quick things about the Quran. Just since I have the mic, I'm going to exploit it. First of all, in the Quran, God doesn't speak directly to Abraham. Abraham gets this crazy dream, and he actually believes the dream and consults Isaac. And the dream is very explicit, slaughter him. None of this evasive Jewish, raise the offering, whatever it means stuff.
Exactly. No, it's true. The theory is that Muhammad heard stories from Jews of the Bible. Either he heard them badly, or the Jews didn't remember them very well, and then put them into the Quran, right, as alternative readings. So that's the case. What's interesting, I don't see in Christianity and Islam, maybe it's my lack of reading, but I don't see this playfulness that Judaism has of the fight of compassion as much. Right? The Jews are very into answering God back. And in fact, that's been used as an anti-Semitic trope. I won't have to quote who because it's not appropriate, but look at these Jews. They even argue with God. Look how bad they are. It's an anti-Semitic trope that Jews argue with God, which is unfortunate, but I'm proud of the tradition. I see God as an educator to us, as training us to be prize fighters for justice. Right? And this is a training program, which is very harsh and difficult, and lots of us drop out. But that's the aim. And that Abraham and Moses, who later fights God on Sinai many times, are God's hero prize fighters for justice no matter what, even if it means taking on God.
What I always find so intriguing about the rabbinic commentary is it's so illuminating about the gaps and the problems and the contradictions in the biblical text, in the Torah. So what's God doing testing? Doesn't he already know? How could he give such a command, right? And how could Isaac be so passive? That was really fascinating in your Midrash passages, how they make Isaac into an agent and a character that seems to be completely absent, I think, from the Torah. So that's always so illuminating to me what the problems are.
Yeah.
But I wanted to propose, I'm very struck by the fact that God does not stop Abraham directly. God, as you said at the beginning, God has been involved with Abraham since Genesis 12 directly, and more so than he will be with any of the successors, with Jacob, but never with Joseph. So he's so directly, personally involved with Abraham. He doesn't stop him. He sends a messenger, an intermediary, to do it, and he never speaks to Abraham again.
Right.
So I'm really struck by that. And one of the hypotheses I have, which is usually very unacceptable, but I wonder what you think, is that this Abraham looks so different from the Abraham negotiating with God about Sodom and the treatment of the wicked people of Sodom. Could the test, I've sometimes wondered if the test that God is doing is this an Abraham who, as in Genesis 18, would stand up to me and give me his view of the human understanding of justice and debate it with me? He does not do that, and in that sense, he fails the test. I don't know if...
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I think of that. I'll say two things. So first one, in terms of the silence of Isaac. So I love modern television and cinema and good literature, and the silences are where it's at. If you've ever seen the TV series Mad Men, it's all about what's not said. Right? And the good actor can stand, or actress can stand on the screen and just say nothing, and you know exactly what they're feeling. And that's the Isaac in this story. You've got to watch what Isaac's thinking, even if he doesn't say it aloud. Some people are quite quiet. Doesn't mean they're not thinking. There's a lot going on here. As the shocked grandmother is when their children do shocking things and they mustn't say anything. The grandmother will say, "I'm not saying anything. I'm thinking plenty, but I'm not saying anything." Right. But in terms of the issue of Abraham, I'm not so sure. I'll tell you why. God says to Abraham with Sodom and Gomorrah, "Shall I hide from?" I'm translating. Should I hide from Abraham what I intend to do, as he's going to be a leader of great nations? God is asking Abraham to argue, whereas in this story he's not. And that implies that even though you're always meant to be a fighter for compassion and justice, there's also points at which you're supposed to accept authority. But which is it? And isn't that the challenge? Right? You accept authority until you think it's unjust, and then you challenge it. But how do I know? How do I know? So what does the Torah do? Gives you both answers in the same section to force you. When do you argue, when do you not? And maybe God wanted Abraham to eventually not do it, or not be excited at least to do it, and that was a failure. But I think we have to live in the Torah doesn't come down to one side or the other. We have to live in the dichotomy between the two. The secret to reading Bible is reading slowly the text, as you clearly do, but look at the bigger picture. Think of Abraham's entire life, not just one part, and I like to do this. Look at the whole character from beginning to end, and imagine making a film of the life of Abraham and how all the bits come together. And then you start seeing things you didn't. I don't know if you've seen Aviva Zornberg's reading, that Abraham always felt guilty that he got his nephew's father, his brother, killed. And maybe this is coming back to haunt him later on. So what Aviva, Professor Zornberg, is doing there is putting the stories together in the bigger picture. So, we like to say, well, we're going to read today chapter 22, and we're going to analyze this text, and some rabbi or commentator, academic interprets it. But how could you possibly understand it without reading the chapter before, and the context and the bigger picture of the story? So that's another part, close reading, and then big picture to see those issues. So I hope that was
And I think really important task and very interesting is just study exactly what happens between Genesis 18 and the Sodom negotiation and the Akeidah in 22.
Yes.
The episodes, it looks sort of arbitrary, but it's, it's a good task to consider whether it's significant what happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just like the Moses ones as well. You have to look at all the examples where Moses argued with God, and sometimes he doesn't. And why? So I think the answer clearly is read more Bible. The kind of thing a rabbi is bound to say, right? But there we go.
Is it possible that God is so angry with Abraham and he knows he should not speak to him in that much anger? So he sends his messengers to speak on his behalf. And this gets at what you said about the anger, but it gets also at the Jewish view, unlike the one of Islam, that submission is not the point. And God is angry over that much submission. And it sort of gets at all the things that why the Jewish view is the correct one, and that God is so angry over these potential other views, he needs somebody else to speak for him.
Let me finish on responding to that, because it relates to what you said. If you look up in the Torah, there are many examples where it talks about God being angry. Maimonides says clearly in the guide, they all have the same thing in common. They're talking about idolatry. And Maimonides says God doesn't really get angry, because you have to get angry because you're upset about something. God doesn't get upset because God's consistent. But why use the word anger for this particular idolatry? Because that's the worst thing. And for Maimonides, idolatry is not an evil, it's a denial of reality. There aren't multiple gods. There aren't competing powers. There's a holistic, consistent universe with a pattern in it. And therefore, idolatry is not a religious mistake. It's like thinking the earth is flat. You're just wrong and you're foolish. And that's terrible for Maimonides. And therefore, God gets angry metaphorically. But God's not really angry, just like the parent is not really angry when they shout at the child. The child goes, Dad's clearly angry, he's shouting at me. But Dad's faking it, because Dad's a great educator. And God is a mechanech, an educator. And that approach allows to save. It looks like God's angry, but not really. And we should be the same as well. Never really be angry, because then you're losing your focus. But you might sometimes give an impression of it to educate for a purpose. And also it makes great moments in movies as well to shout. Anyway, I think we should end, because it's been a lot. I want to thank you for inviting me and for the support from the shuls over here. And I'll hang out over here afterwards for the questions, but I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful Shana Tova, good New Year. Thank you so much.